So that's a really interesting study, and it's a study that's using a next generation BTK inhibitor, which is called Acalabrutinib. And this drug is exciting because it is much more specific for Bruton's tyrosine kinase. And whereas ibrutinib it does bind and counteract Bruton's tyrosine kinase, unfortunately it also binds to a whole host of other TKIs, or tyrosine kinases. And this Acalabrutinib actually is much more specific. It doesn't interfere with many of these other tyrosine kinases, and therefore there should be fewer, at least theoretically, fewer off-target side effects. There should be fewer side effects related to Acalabrutinib because it's very specific for the BTK, which is present in the mantle cell lymphoma. So this study was a study which has been recently conducted. It was over 100 patients by Dr. Wang, but he was the lead investigator, but there were many different sites internationally that were involved in this trial. And this was for patients with relapsed and refractory mantle cell lymphoma. These had a variety of different treatments initially, and the median number of previous treatments was 2. And there was also quite a heterogeneous patient population. Some of them had extranodal disease, some of them had bulky disease. These are sort of risk factors that are known to perhaps influence outcome. There's also something called MIPI, which is a prognostic index, and about 40% had a higher risk MIPI. But there was quite heterogeneous or higher or intermediate grade MIPI. And the results of the study were interesting in that the objective response rate was 80%, and they measured objective response using different criteria, either investigator measured radiologic response or objective response, or there was a central review. But the response rates were pretty similar. There was about 40% complete responses, and the data that was kind of interesting was that the toxicity profile was very favorable. There were very few grade 3 and grade 4 toxicities. The toxicities that we look out for most, which are toxicities that were associated with ibrutinib, are cardiac problems, particularly arrhythmias and atrial arrhythmias. And interestingly, in these patients that were treated in this study, there were no examples of atrial arrhythmias, which is better than one would expect. And that could be related to the specificity of this BTK inhibitor over, let's say, ibrutinib. It is a relatively small sample size, 100, so we don't know if there may be more or some examples of atrial fibrillation if you were to treat 1,000 patients, because it is a fairly low frequency event. There weren't serious grade 3 or grade 4 bleeding. I think there might have been, there were very few grade 3 or grade 4 bleeding. It was not a major issue, and that's something that we look out for because that is a complication or potential complication with ibrutinib. The major low-grade or grade 1 or grade 2 toxicity was headache, which was something new, and it's hard to explain why these patients got headache because it wasn't really seen with ibrutinib. And apparently this side effect was self-limited. It didn't persist throughout the entire treatment. It occurred at the beginning of treatment and apparently was something that seemed to decrease with time on the treatment. These patients may stay on this quite a long time, indefinitely. And there were no patients who discontinued treatment because of the headache. So all in all, it looks like it's hard to compare different studies because of slightly different patient populations. And all in all, if anything, the response rates that were seen are as good or better than what we believe historically from ibrutinib. But again, it's hard to comparison. You really need a randomized controlled trial. It's hard to comment on the duration of responses because they haven't yet been reached in the this current trial, the Acalabrutinib trial. It seems like it might be a slightly better. The caveat is that if you sort of look at the patient populations between the two trials, it may be that in this Acalabrutinib trial, it was a slightly better patient population than we're seeing in the than were used in the Abrutinib trial. For example, there were only 2 median previous courses of treatments, whereas with Abrutinib there were 3. So the better clinical objective response rate may be partially related to the fact that these patients' population was a little better. We don't know, but it's certainly as good, and if anything, perhaps even a little better than is expected in terms of the clinical response rate. And the toxicity profile is probably a little better. The things that we worry about, and which are really problems in the older population that would be candidates for this drug, things like cardiac arrhythmias, things like bleeding, because many of these patients may be on other types of anticoagulation for various reasons. Those seem to occur less frequently, given the limits with the small sample size in different studies than we're seeing with Abrutinib. So it's certainly a positive, encouraging trial. It may, in the United States, the data from this trial apparently resulted in it being designated by the FDA as a breakthrough designation for approval, and we'll see what happens in Canada. But it looks promising. It would be great to have another BTK inhibitor available to us with perhaps a slightly different, profile of a drug profile. So I think it looks it's basically a positive study in my view, encouraging.